going back, I've been on the inflation side for a few years now.
That's right.
And that funny thing is, I'm surprised by the speed with the inflation we got. I mean, part of it, when you add a war to the mix that was not, necessarily anticipated by me or a lot of other people, or at least not at this time frame or in this scale, that certainly adds inflationary force to it. And so the Fed being more hawkish than expected. But if you look at, say, where inflation is and where rates are, in some ways they're the most dovish they've ever been.
That's right.
The biggest disconnect between rates and inflation since 1951. And so I think their clear mandate is to try to tighten. And the hard part for them is that they have a horrible track record of tightening into a decelerating economy, right? So if they tighten while PMIs are rising, they generally have a better shot of getting some decent gains there. Whereas if they're trying to tighten into a slowing economy, that's kind of the recipe for disaster. That's kind of when you ran into in late 2018. And so they're kind of running in that same environment now, but of course inflation is much higher. So I don't know exactly how far they're going to get, but I'm going to take the under on whatever consensus is for how far they're going to get. If you look at over the prior expansion period, right? So a decade-long expansion, you had like 3 mini cycles in there. You had rising, declining PMIs roughly on 3-year periods. And so you had these slowdowns that did not necessarily result in recessions. This one's a little trickier because we do also have yield curves inverted for a period of time. Some percentage of the yield curve is inverted. So there are kind of more recession indicators this time, but we're still in that period where we're dipping. It's unclear if it's going to manifest an actual recession or if we're going to kind of dip and then have a rising period out of this. If you look at Atlanta Fed GDP now forecast, last I looked, they were looking at something like 1% real growth annualized for this quarter. So there are a lot of things that look slow. And I think as you look out maybe 6 months, the question is this kind of a valley, higher growth thing? I don't think we have enough data to say for sure yet, but it's not looking fantastic at the moment.
Okay. Well, do you think rate hikes are going to push us into a recession?
Well, so the only thing that rate hikes can really control here, because all the inflation we're seeing is two main things. One is there's all the fiscal stimulus, so it's more money in the system. And number two, you have supply side inflation, so commodity shortages, supply chain problems, add a war to the mix. And so the Fed, they can't print oil, they can't print copper, they can't fix supply chains. So all that they can really do is try to reduce demand, which risks putting you into a recession. Right? It's kind of that whole game of they want to slow down demand, maybe soften it, get a dip, but they don't really want to cause a recession. But it's almost like you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here. So I'm not optimistic that they're going to have a soft landing.
Do we need to see interest rates at the same level of inflation, percentage-wise, before we see inflation come down? Is that what we need?
So that could certainly give a shock to the system, a deflationary shock. But I think the inflationary pressures are deeper than that. I don't think the Fed's tools really, especially given how high debt levels are, that they really have the tools to properly fight inflation. I think it's more of a fiscal problem, and it's more of just how we've structured supply chains. I think that this is only going to be resolved by improving supply chains, improving commodity capex, kind of the real world changes, and those are not quick changes. But one thing I caution people on is that for example, I'm staying in the inflationary camp. Before the war, I was expecting maybe like a localized top in inflation. So we've obviously added fuel to that fire. But I don't really expect inflation necessarily to be a straight line. I think that we're going to be in a very inflationary decade compared to the prior decade at least. But even I'm still anticipating eventually slowdowns in inflation. Maybe the Fed gets a handle of it for a period of time, but then they end up having to loosen because they go too far, you have a recession, and then they cut, and then you get another round of inflation.
That's right.
So in the 70s, you saw multiple rounds of inflation. In the 40s, you saw multiple rounds of inflation. These things tend to come in bursts.
Suppose the Fed were to reduce the growth of M2 money supply. Are you saying that wouldn't be sufficient? You also need congressional support to somehow rein back spending, I guess?
Partially, because it depends on where that M2 growth is coming from. So, for example, in the 70s, it mostly came from bank lending. Right? Banks would lend more money into existence because you had the demographics boom, right? So you had all the baby boomers starting to buy homes. Because of the demographic demand for commodities, and you had the M2 expansion from loans. That was a contributor. If we go back to the 40s, it wasn't that banks were lending; it was that the government was spending a lot of fiscal deficits, into existence and having it monetized.
Right.
And so that's the M2 growth we've seen over the past 2 years. A lot of it is from that fiscal impulse, and they're rather rate insensitive. I mean, if they want to pass a fiscal bill, they're not looking and saying, well, what are our treasury rates at? They're just kind of passing it, right? So it really comes down to watching political gridlock, right? Because that's the environment that they're increasingly in, is this kind of gridlocked environment. And so it really does come down to Congress, but even if I think you had a perfect Congress, bringing this down immediately without causing, kind of a recession is challenging. It's kind of pick one, inflation
That's right.
or recession, and only in the longer run can you say, okay, how can we have the economy allocate its resources better? How can we get more commodities? How can we get more infrastructure? How can we diversify our supply chains? And that only comes with time.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information. And it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
I have bad news for you. If you're not rich by now, you're screwed. And if you're in debt, you're even double screwed. How so, you might wonder? Well, the sad truth is that you're working your whole life to make someone else rich. The mega corporations, the banks, the politicians, everyone is getting richer. They get your money. And what is even worse, they get your time, they get your life. You are not even in a rat race. You're in a financial prison. But what could a solution for you look like? Honestly, I don't know, but I know what a solution for me would look like. It's very simple. I use whatever money I have and I multiply it with 1,000. This could make my life much easier and probably yours as well. If you have $1,000 available and multiply this with 1,000, I believe that this could solve some financial issue for the one or the other. Of course, if you're ugly, you would have to multiply it with much more than 1,000. My name is Markus Dahn, and this is what I decided to do. I decided to 1000x my money. This is not a joke. I know what you may be thinking. What is this guy talking about? How should this work? This is not possible. Well, I made a detailed video where I laid out my plan. And some clever folks might even want to look at this plan and copy it and do exactly what I do. This is just a little hint on the side. You have two options. You leave, you forget what you have seen. You do whatever you're doing and you hope that somehow you get some other results. Good luck with that. Or you click the link below the video. You enter your email address because I'm not showing this to everybody. You at least watch my video on how I plan to 1000x my money. The choice is yours. Make the right choice. Join me. See what a different future you could have. See at least how I plan to do the 1000x. So click on the link below, enter your email address, and I see you on the other side. Your Markus Dahn.